You all look familiar. Have we met? I think we did, right? Monday. I told you I'd be teaching. I wasn't lying. How's everybody doing? Yeah? Feeling good? Ish? Meh? Yeah, I'm assuming some of you, many of you, may be feeling a little bit starting to, yeah, I'm not really fully done with yesterday. I didn't fully grasp the learning outcomes that were set out for yesterday or maybe the day before even. How many people kind of feeling a little bit of that nervous anxiety? Yeah, half of the class, if not more. So as you can tell from my tone, not something that is unique to your cohort or to yourself. Why do you think it's okay that you're not fully feeling comfortable with yesterday, or maybe even all of this week so far before we move on to other stuff? Why do you think that's okay? Because there's a lot left and we have limited time. That's part of it. That's part of it, but that still doesn't answer the question fully. You're subconsciously working on this? Right. Yeah, it's crazy how many times like I'll be stuck on something at night. Probably has already happened to some of you with software development already in like the first few days where you're like stuck on something the night before. You go to bed, you wake up, and you're like, that was a 5-minute thing for me to figure out. I understand this more. Has this not happened yet? It will. It will happen. So your brain is subconsciously working on this, and of course we talked about sleep on the first day to help facilitate that process as well. But I'm looking for something more. Why would it be okay to move on from objects? Let's say yesterday was objects, right? Where you're not fully feeling comfortable working with objects. Let's use that as an example. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to go with, what's your name? Chris? Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was looking for, is that we're not moving on. Trick question, right? We're actually not moving on from objects. We are, for the most part, like 99% of what we teach is very deliberate in terms of, A, just-in-time learning. Like now is the time to go deeper into this topic, but also kind of a compounding effect, right? So stuff we covered yesterday is still relevant today and so on. So you're not really moving on from objects. You're constantly practicing them, right? And while you may think, well, that means that I really ought to understand objects from yesterday so that I can continue working on with them, you know, there's a little bit of a gray area there in that it's okay that you understand a certain percentage of it and that you will, it may snowball if it's too much of this, right? If you're not fully understanding a bunch of stuff and then you're moving on, yeah, that can snowball. And we're here to help and support with that. But it's okay to not have 100% of that grasp, right? So just wanted to, I know as the week progresses, first day not so much, second day not as bad, and then usually it's the Wednesday, yesterday, that people start to feel a little bit uneasy. Is that a fair enough assumption based on what I've seen? Yeah, for some of you anyway. Anyway, it's my first lecture with you, isn't it? That's pretty cool and exciting. I don't always get a week 1 lecture with every cohort. As you can imagine, the scheduling changes. We have a lot. We have some instructors you haven't met yet. Who have you had so far? Nima? That's it? Oh, okay. So I'm like oh, wow, okay. So yeah, every cohort, as you know, is different in terms of the variety and the type of people you get for different lectures. Keeps things interesting, keeps things fresh, and exciting. You have no idea who you're going to get in the morning. So a little bit about me before we get going. It's my first lecture with you, so a little bit of expectation setting. You may have already noticed this, but I have a few like bad habits. One of them is talking fast. Okay, so like I get excited, I talk fast. It's a family hereditary thing, I think. And so please slow me down. Definitely not going to be offended or hurt if you kind of just say, hey, can you repeat that? Or can you slow down? Or just ask me a question, right? Interrupt and ask a question. I will curb if it's too much of like people not raising their hands. And then, you know, sometimes, for example, what I'll do is I'll prompt questions. And so for me, lectures are about the dialogue, not about learning a new topic from the lecturer. I think lectures are a terrible way to learn new things because many reasons. You have to pay attention for 2 hours straight. That's crazy, right? Or an hour and a half, whatever that is. I know I zone out a lot. Like when I'm in a long lecture, it's very hard for even a good lecturer to keep my attention for the entire 45 minutes plus another 45 minutes, right? Like they may say a word that triggers a memory. They may do something that I still am thinking about that while they're moving on, right? Like the pacing is tough, right? That's why a lot of people prefer videos over real-time lectures. They have their benefits, but then they have their drawbacks. So I guess what I'm saying is like, it's okay if, let's say I ask a question of you, specifically I point to you and I ask a question because I've heard too much from someone else, and you're like, I actually wasn't paying attention. I zoned out. I'm not gonna, like, I think in here as a collective we should acknowledge that that happens and not feel guilty or offended by that happening. Okay, so that gives me the ability to, though, point at people and feel less guilty about asking them a question, right? Also, I don't know people's names, and so that's another thing I'm going to work on a little bit. It takes me quite a few weeks because I don't lecture every day, right? I don't mentor as much as I used to, so there's a little bit of that as well. I mentioned my name up here because it is a mouthful. Can everybody see this? Yeah? Excellent. You can call me KV, you can call me Kuram. Sometimes people like really say my name fast and just say Crum. That's okay too. That's a lot of my friends call me that. My background, as I mentioned, so I'm not going to go into all of the day one introduction stuff, but it is in software development. I work on the curriculum almost every day, or oversee that kind of stuff, as well as Compass, right? So if you have complaints or feedback or just ideas, definitely feel free to Slack me. I forgot to mention on day one that I sit right there along with the other instructors, right? And so as you can tell, like one of the things I like about our space, we didn't always have this and I didn't like it, but now I do, which is that we sit along with the students, right? And so there's this open door policy. You can have a question, you can Slack me, or you can come up and chat. I'm here for that, when I'm here. Or if I'm not here, Slack. Is that cool? For me, lectures are not about, as I mentioned, the like, let's talk about callbacks and really only talk about callbacks and like new knowledge. Of course, guilty kind of necessary evil is we are going to introduce some new topics in lecture. We try to sometimes do review versus introduce new topics, like have a little bit of reading on it the night before. But in some cases, we can't. It's just harder. And so today's lecture is an example where like new topics will be discussed, and then you'll go work on them. But I don't care as much about making sure that I cover the bullets of these things that I have up here. So for example, I have up here functions as values, anonymous functions, and callbacks. So that's my kind of agenda for new topics that I'm going to cover today. But really what I like to focus on, which I think lectures are really good at, is that like problem solving together and learning from the person that's up here how they problem solve and watch them kind of literally observe them and talk to them about problem solving. So really I focus on the approach, the dev approach. You know, the lecture that you had on day 2, I think that should be a theme for all lectures, right? But of course, getting more and more complicated in terms of here's a bigger problem, how do we solve that together, right? So you will see me throughout these topics really kind of take that approach a little bit, and I'll call it out when it makes sense. Cool? I take awkward pauses, so this is what my coffee is for. I like specifically either without prompting or with prompting, I'll ask a question, I'll take an awkward pause. One of my pet peeves from instructors, at least in my as a student back in university and so on, was that teachers would either not stop for questions enough, or when they would stop for questions, you didn't have time to think. They would either move on or somebody would interject with an answer. So if I see too much of that happening either from myself or students, where you're not getting time to think about it with the awkward pause, then I will mute someone and be like, hey, too much interjection, actually, great answers, but like, don't want you to answer right away. I want people to think. I want hands raised to see how many people already have an answer before we move on. Those kind of things are tactics that I use, and so please don't get offended when I do things like that. Is that cool? Awesome. All right, and joke. Yeah, I'm supposed to start off with a joke. That's a thing I try to do as a ritual. Or sometimes students have a joke, but I try to keep them like relevant, programming jokes that are relevant to the week. So when we get to databases, I have like a database joke. When we get to Ruby, I have like a Ruby joke, so on and so forth. This week's a bit harder because it's week 1. So I'll do a more like generic programming joke. Is that cool? And then if somebody else has a better one, I'm all yours. How many software developers does it take to screw on a light bulb? You know that one? No? None. It's a hardware problem. We like to blame the other guys, right? Okay, so let's get started. Functions. I'm going to talk about functions a lot today. And you're like, well, I already know functions. We started them in prep course. I've been using them all along. Really? But there's definitely a lot more to functions than what you've already covered. And so we're going to go deeper into that topic. Here's a function. A function, there's comments in there. We'll talk about the comments as well. But here's a function. What's it doing? It's called greet, right? Just keeping it simple. And it's taking in one argument. Is that a fair statement? And it is logging to the screen essentially a string that's combining that argument with the word hello. So hello space their name, right? Fairly simple. And so in order to call this function, we know this is a bit of a review, but like let's just create that base. We do something like this, right? And this will call the function. So I expect this program to, well, actually, I realize I didn't give it a name. So what will I expect this to do? So are you making a guess? Is that a hypothesis? Or is that something you're like firm on? Final answer. Was it, what's that game show called? We kept saying final answer. It's kind of dating myself here. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Yeah. All right. You don't want to call a friend or anything like that? I want another guess. That may or may not be right. I'll say that. Yeah. Error is a good guess. Both are good guesses. Another guess. There's many different outcomes that can happen from this. I wasn't intending to talk about it at this stage, but since I made the typo, let's go with it. Any other guesses? So error, it will just say hello because you didn't pass it a name. Those are both valid guesses because different languages will behave differently here, and you're just guessing what JavaScript will do. What else? There should be at least a third that you should be able to guess, I think. Hello and undefined. That actually is the correct answer, but we'll see that. And so, again, approach, right? Like having a hypothesis, it's okay to guess. This is I talked about that I would talk about the dev approach. It's okay to have a hypothesis. Always have a hypothesis, so your brain is thinking versus being on autopilot. It's very easy to get into autopilot when your computer is going to run the program for you. So you're going to run it in your head. You're going to come up with a guess. It's okay to be wrong, and then you're going to run the code. Okay, that's one of the things I want to really focus on. Okay, so let's run it and see what happens. What is it called? Files one. Even things like that, right? You just notice what I did there. I didn't type out the whole name of the file. I bet you some of you do. I've mentored enough to know that there is the variety of students that will, based on experience, not do tab completion. Even these types of little nuances that you see me do up here or other instructors, I expect you to like write those down as notes. How did he do that? You could ask, but to be honest, you could probably Google it, right? And so just write it down as homework for yourself. That was tab completion. And what we expect to see is hello undefined, right? Or maybe we expect to see different, and we learn something out of that, right? About the language. Very cool. And so really what I meant to do is something like this, which would do hello KV, right? So we're comfortable with this. And just out of curiosity, going a little bit advanced, but what would happen if I did this? It, again, is language-specific behavior. So we're asking from a JavaScript perspective, what would happen in JavaScript if we did this? And you may or may not know this. It depends on how much you read the details in the prep course. It will work. Okay, and more details on that? And sorry, your name? Theo. Theo, and your name? Tom. Tom, what are you going to say?
I can't remember the exact name for it, but it'll pull the function.
It will?
Pull the information from the function.
Okay, so you're saying it will still work as well?
Yeah.
And you're trying to explain why?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Anybody want to say it doesn't work? No lifelines? Everybody feels comfortable with those answers? It will work? You're confident? Or you're not confident? How many people are confident this will work? Only a few of you. Some of you are like, I actually have no idea, but I'll go along. Let's see. Cool. The other alternative is, of course, that it won't work. And why would it not work in other languages? It will work in this language. Why will it not work in other languages? Yeah, it's kind of confusing. Like, how could you call something that doesn't exist, right? Because if I did var x equals 5, but then I did like console log x, I don't expect that to print 5, do I? And it wouldn't. So how do I expect the function, which is declared later, to behave differently than that? It's confusing, right? Agreed? Like, this will not print 5 because how could you console log x before you've made it set it to 5, right? Yeah, so this is an interesting one. We'll come back to the 5, okay? We'll come back to the 5. I have actually said everything correctly, but I have left out the hoisting part, which we're going to talk about, okay? Which is what you were looking to remember, was the hoisting word. And hoisting isn't a super important topic, okay? So I'm a little bit, in my mind I'm going, is this, yeah, it's not super important to talk about, but we're there, I guess. So yeah, this will work, and this will do its thing, which is confusing. Most languages will not allow this. Like in C, C++, Java, maybe Ruby, Python, not allowed, right? Like declare the function before you use it. Most languages. JavaScript's a bit different. JavaScript's a bit confusing, right? Pros and cons. So far, so good. How am I doing on pacing and talking? Am I talking too fast? No? Let me know, though. So we call this hoisting. If you don't remember that, that's okay. We're not going to be like, what is hoisting? And if you don't get that question, you don't get the job. Like, I hope you don't go get those kind of tech interviews, right? They're not, in my opinion, good use of time. I mean, it'd be nice to know why something like this behaves. You remember the word or not remember the word, right? Cool. So anyway, we'll move it back down here so it's not as confusing. With regards to the variable, there is hoisting happening here as well. What's actually happening is x is being defined as undefined up here, magically. And so really what's happening is var x, and then x equals 5. JavaScript kind of does multi-pass, and in doing so, it hoists everything to the top, including the functions. But functions, everything goes to the top, which is nice. And so they're usable, but nice or bad. So they're usable even early on. And then with the variables, it's a bit different, where they get declared. The memory is taken up, but they're not set, right? So this will still not print 5, right? It doesn't make any sense for that would print 5 because I set it afterwards. And so we're going to get console log undefined when I print the value of 5 before it's actually set. And that, again, would be the same as if I did this. This is a bit of a review, I know, but essentially, we're talking about hoisting here, right? And if you don't fully understand that, write it down in your notes. This is the kind of note-taking I expect. I don't expect code along, right? As I'm writing code, don't code along. But I do expect that whether it's on your laptop or in your notes, if you feel the urge, like, I don't fully understand this, it's homework for yourself. Not by homework, I mean after lecture, right? So what's interesting about functions, going beyond just review, is you can do, actually, let's ask the question. So what happens if I do console log greet kv? First of all, what am I doing there? I have nested expressions. Nested expressions going further, I would argue, and I'm using certain like lingo or jargon deliberately. Nested expressions, right? There's an expression here with another expression inside of it, right? And so our eyes, and this is another thing about dev approach, is I actually see something different when I look at this line. I actually see two lines in my head. I mean, figuratively speaking, right? I actually see something like, and I'm just using I don't know, it doesn't really matter what I'm calling this, because I'm just seeing it temporarily in my head. And that's what I see. First expression, what's the return value of that? Pass it to the second expression, the outer expression. Right? This will take time for you. If you're already comfortable with that, great, good for you. If you're not surprised, because that probably, for those of you that haven't done as much code previously, right? So another skill that you will develop over time, it'll take a few weeks, is being comfortable seeing nested expressions where you're kind of running them in your head as like an onion, I guess, or like a Russian doll, you know, where you're kind of seeing what's inside and then outside and so on, right? Okay, so what will that do? I just did the same thing, just in 2 lines. What will that do? Sorry? Console log. And what will it console log? That's a good question. an error is a fair assumption. Why do you think it'll be an error? It's already printed something, but specifically when I do this, what am I saying here? What is this line saying? It's saying call greet, and then when we have the left side being equal to something, what does that mean? Assign the value of t to be what the function returns. Specifically, I was looking for the word returns, right? So is the function returning anything? No, there's no explicit return. So what will t be is what we're really trying to figure out here. Is it going to be an error because it's it's a good question. What does console.log return? But you know what? Irrelevant question, I will say, but fair, good attempt. In that if I was doing this, then I was returning the value of console log. But I'm not, right? So in this, it's not like it'll just implicitly return this line. It literally has no return value. What is the lack of a value in JavaScript? Undefined. And so actually there's an implicit return undefined here. And so t is declared. Therefore, it's not going to throw an error that it couldn't find t. And t's value is going to be undefined. Sorry for the other outputs there. I forgot to comment them out. But we can see that the final output is indeed undefined. Right? And if I remove that line, the same behavior will occur. Because the final line is still outputting undefined. And there's an implicit return undefined if there is no return in a function. Again, some of it's JavaScript-specific behavior, so I care less about you learning that, but since we're already learning with JavaScript, we're not here to learn JavaScript, we're here to learn with JavaScript. And okay, a necessary evil of that is we're going to learn JavaScript, right? And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do try to stay away from too many of the JavaScript nuances. The important thing is that we are making assumptions, whether they're right or wrong, and that we're learning the language through experimentation, not just through documentation, right? As you learn your second language later in program, like Ruby, you'll hopefully apply these kind of tactics. You'll remember this stuff because you'll be hopefully following this kind of tactic of learning constantly through experimentation. Any questions about this stuff before I continue? What happens if you return console log? Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. This is the kind of stuff I want you to be asking as you're learning something new. What is the return value of console log? Right? I mean, we can test it, right? Actually, one of the ways you might have noticed is if you do something like this in just the REPL. Because what the REPL does is it automatically console logs the value of the previous line. So you automatically see what is this going to return. Not only what is this going to do, it's going to run the line, which will do a print. But then it will also show you what that line returned, what it evaluated to. And so we actually see that. That's why we see the undefined as the thing when we do a console log in the REPL. Because it's running, it's doing that var t equals console log, and then it's outputting the t, which is the return value of console log, which is undefined. Pretty interesting, right? I bet you these are things that, like, none of this is really new, but kind of a different way of experimenting with the language and playing with it. And yes, there's tutorials, there's walkthroughs that we offer or the internet offers when you're learning something new. And guess what they don't do? They don't, and I think this is a fault of ours or theirs, they don't really push you to experiment, to tinker. All right? They go, okay, in order to build this app, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. And you just kind of follow along, and half the time you're on autopilot. Right? And so I'm going to try and give you some tactics to address not going on autopilot. This is one of those. Anyway, let's resume our conversations around functions. So we have a greet function. We're able to do that. And we're able to, let's bring this back into the onion that it was, where you had a function call inside of another function call. Yes? How do I know it's a function call? I see parentheses, right? That's function call. Agreed? What happens if I do that? I have one guess. Again, there'll be multiple things, depends on the language, but I'm asking in JavaScript, what will this do?
Undefined and then print an error, or have an error. First undefined is from the console.
So the assumption that you're making, I forget your name?
Julian.
Julian, is that the function gets called
And it'll be well,
with undefined, and therefore you'll see a console log.
no, so that function will be.
Oh, so you're changing your answer.
No.
Yeah?
No.
Yeah, you said it'll say undefined from the function call.
I'll say it'll say that greet is not.
But greet is defined, right? Greet is a function.
But there's a variable, right? Because it's not a function when you're calling it.
It's not a function when you're calling it.
Because no parentheses.
So I'm not calling it,
Yeah.
right? Which is why you're saying it's not going to go into the function.
Yeah.
Okay. So in your mind, line 11 will execute, and line 8 will never execute.
Yeah.
Okay, so what will we actually see then? We're not going to see hello space something or undefined or whatever that is. What are we going to see? But greet is defined. Did I? Not as a variable. Oh, okay, interesting. Well, I mean, these are great guesses, right? Like, nothing wrong with your guesses. Turns out they're all wrong. But, you know, it's all good. Oops, sorry. Not the REPL, but the thing. Actually, what we see is like some kind of a detail about that function. Holy crap. So we just learned something new, again, with the what if, right? And that's okay that you didn't think to do that what if. There's many what ifs that I haven't thought to do even today, right? After 15 so years in software development. But that's interesting. Function greet. I can actually refer to it by its name and console log it, much like a variable. Pretty interesting. Can't do that in every language. Can't do that in Ruby as easily, right? Or Python. I mean, there's ways around it, but it's not like you just take that word, greet, and put it onto the puts or whatever the console log equivalent is in the language, and stuff will start behaving this way. It won't behave this way. What does this tell us implicitly? The hint was in the name of the file that I was experimenting with, but if I could console log the word that refers to the function and without throwing an error, it's actually saying, yeah, actually what you're outputting there is a function. What does that tell us? Hmm?
It can't detect that you haven't declared a variable, but it's suggesting that it's declared as a function.
Yeah, even though it's not var greet, I seem to be able to refer to it. Wait, so if I can refer to it as a console log and I can pass it in as a value to a function, just like a variable, can't I assign that value to another variable? Right? Like if I can console log x, I can assign x to a variable. Similarly, if I can console log greet, can't I assign greet to a variable? That would be my next guess, or my next thing that I would want to check. And so, I mean, we'll keep that console log there, but var say hello, giving it a different name, equals greet. And then, what happens if I console log say hello? Right, that would be my next kind of like, let's just see what that is, because if I just assign it to a variable, I have no idea what the output is. I'm running a program here, let's see what that value is, right? Are you guys still with me? Am I going too fast? No, cool. So what's the value going to be? What's the output going to be? Is this going to work? I think it will, because greet is a value, it seems. And I can therefore assign it to a variable, and then I can output that value. But what I expect to see is some kind of a, yeah, that's the same value, right? It's the function, right? Agreed? Shall I? What do you think this part will say? Because it seems to give it the name, right? We have two guesses here. It's either going to be say hello or greet. Yes? It'll be greet, because that's the original name. It's a named function, right? You have a variable called say hello, fine, but the function's name is greet. And what does that also tell us? It tells us that there is only one function in memory right now, not two. We didn't create a new function. We simply have two names for it. And the second name, say hello, is really just the name of a variable. Have you guys already been introduced to Python Tutor? Well, did Dima introduce Python Tutor in lecture? Yeah. So if I was to take this in Python Tutor, I'm not going to do that. Other things to talk about. But you could do that later if you like. You know, the notes will be out. And you could see that, like, there'll be a function in memory, and then there'll be two things pointing to it. Two arrows, right? Greet as well as say hello. Right? Shall I whiteboard this, or are we feeling okay with that so far? At least one nod. Feeling okay? Feeling okay? Cool. Just learned some new stuff here, right? Functions are values. They can be passed around. Holy shit. That's pretty crazy. Did not expect that. What does that mean? I don't care. What does that really mean? Like, I understand what functions are. What are functions? What are functions in English? They're a pretty integral part of software, aren't they? Right? Like, I don't think you'll come across software in any language that has a lack of functions. It's very rare. Not fully true, actually, what I just said, but anyway, most code that you'll come across will have functions. What are functions what is a synonym for functions that non-developers would understand? An English word. Program. A function, you could think of it as a program, as a sub-program or a mini program, yes. But even that's too technical. Program. I want like non-technical. Let me actually give you the answer for what is a variable. Like this, what is 5? I would call this data, right? That would be the English term for that. I'm assigning new data. So if X is data, then greet is behavior. Software is really two things. And this was my comment here. Software is made up of two things, data and behavior. You have those two things, you've got a program, right? Agreed? And so really, what we're really saying is actually in JavaScript and languages like JavaScript, our behavior can be treated like data. Which is the kind of like, what? Right? Like our code, the program as you called it, or subroutine is another word for this, right? Like it's a thing that we run, right, as an action, can actually also be perceived as 5, as a number. In that it has the same kind of, we have the ability to pass it around and assign it to variables. Pretty cool. Are we excited by this? You guys look so excited. Yeah. Look at us. We're so excited about this. Cool. Cool, cool. Does anybody here watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine? I just say cool, 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 cool a lot now. It's a problem. But for those of you who haven't watched it, it's on Netflix, and you can watch it after you graduate. You are not allowed to watch Netflix while you're here, right? No Game of Thrones, no Infinity Wars, none of that stuff. What is it called? Infinity? Is it Infinity Wars? Final Endgame or something? Yeah. Pretty crazy. So, you know, that's your carrot at the end of boot camp, right? Hopefully. Nobody's nodding. Everybody's like, yeah, whatever. I got my weekends. Well, you haven't had a weekend yet. Yeah, that's me with Game of Thrones. I'm like, honestly, I don't know if I'm going to watch this season. It's been so long. Although I've kept up to date with it, except for this season. But I was saying, you think you have your weekends. You haven't had your weekend yet. You don't have your weekends. You know this, right? You don't have your weekends. But you do have enough for rest. I'll say that. Okay, let's move on. It's 9:40. I'm going to go a little bit further, and then we're going to take a break. Okay, so if that's okay with everybody, nobody's exhausted, right? So file 2, I once again have that. I'm just starting clean so that we don't have all that code. We'll have it in our notes. So this is, again, the same thing, right? Except it has a bang at the end, exclamation mark. But same function, right? Feeling comfortable with this? But if I'm told that I can take greet and assign it to a variable, that means that I can do this. That same thing that I did last time, right? If I can have a function and then later assign it to a variable as a value, I know that I can do it all. In general, if I have 5, I can assign 5 to a variable at the same time, right? So both create a 5 and assign it at the same time, create a function, assign it at the same time. Actually, I'll just do it right here. I just did the same thing I did in the last file, except I did it all in one line. I declared the function on the right side, and I assigned it to a new variable, all at the same time on the left side. Feeling comfortable with this? Sorry, your name? Min? Does this resonate in terms of what we did earlier and what we're doing now as one line, or no? I know you don't see the file from before, so maybe I'll bring it up. Whoa, just didn't touch the mouse and like did stuff on the editor that may be useful to you. Again, if you want digression, write it down. But anyway, we've got, actually I think I'll go with up and down. And so this is what we had, right? We had greet, and then these lines here, I'm just doing those as one line, right? I just basically moved this, which is saying assign the value of greet to say hello. Well, I have greet in the previous line, right? And so I just move that up, right?
That doesn't look like
It does. So if I take this, line 10, cut, paste, this is what I've got above. I mean, right?
It doesn't have like a bracket after the
It does have the bracket. Are you referring to these parentheses?
No,
Right here, this line?
yeah.
But this line I would erase because I was assigning it on the right side, and so really this is what I've ended up with, right? Because before I was saying var say hello equals greet, but this I no longer need because like I've just moved the whole thing, the assignment to be at the top. So I'm assigning and declaring all in one line. Yeah? So if Min was not sure about this is why I asked. Other people probably weren't. How are people feeling about that now? Like I've basically done it in one line? Yeah? Overall feeling okay? Only slightly uncomfortable with that? Okay. So let's go back to file 2. And here we are, right? And so the assumption I would make, knowing what I know from the previous file, and so what we've talked about so far, is that I can do this, right? Or I can do this. And life's good, no errors, and they will both output the same function because they're both pointing to the same function just like before. Agreed? And so we're going to run this file. It's not file 1, it's actually file 2. And in fact, I screwed up. Oh yes, this is actually interesting. I've totally gapped on this. What's confusing, extra confusing in JavaScript about this is that although it seems like I did the same thing, I actually can't refer to the function by its name when I do this. I don't know why. Ask the inventor of JavaScript. I find this very confusing. It always throws me off. It would just throw me off even though I already knew this. I forgot, right? Because to me, logically, this should work because we just took the previous 2 lines and combined them into one. But that faulty line that doesn't seem to know what greet is, even though right there I have a function named greet, WTF, right? What does WTF stand for? What's that for? Like, I don't understand what is going on. But, you know, this one should work, right? I have a variable. And notice that the function's called greet because I called it greet up here. Right? But this is confusing too. Like, I have 2 names for a function. WTF, what's that for? Like, I only should have one, right? Agreed? Yeah, question?
What if you try to assign say hello to another variable? Would that
Mm-hmm.
fall back to like
Yeah, you can still do, it's a great question. The question is, can I assign say hello to another variable? Absolutely. Say hello, as long as you don't do greet here for some reason. That won't work because greet is unnamed, even though it is named. I don't understand. But like, say hello is a thing. Yeah. Right? And so you should be able to do that. And so now we'll see the same greet function output twice. Right? All of this probably you're wondering, like, what's all this about? Why am I going through this? We'll get there. But I wanted to lay some of that foundational confusion and explanation out there. Any questions so far? Any confusion? Yep.
Can you still call the function using greet and then parentheses?
No, it's really confusing. I can't. This is completely useless.
Okay.
The question was, can I still use greet? You saw I couldn't even console log it. If I can't console log it, I can't call it. Yeah.
Is there a case where you want to be able to access the actual function name over the variable name?
Yeah, so this is actually a great question and a source of confusion and a lot of debate in the JavaScript community, since this is valid. And so the question is like, actually I forgot the question. Can you ask it again?
Is there a case where you need to actually...
Yeah, so what is the value of greet really is you're asking, right? Like what is the importance of greet? Like is there anywhere where greet becomes important?
Yeah, like, because originally you had it where you assigned the variable after the function, and then that worked.
That worked fine, yeah.
Would there be a case where you need to do that over this version on the one line?
Oh, I see. Your question's a bit different than what I thought. So what I'll say is like the approach that we have here is a function declaration, as the comment indicates. But when we move it over, it becomes a function expression. Now the words here aren't super important. Just understand that it actually is a different thing. Whoops. This is a function expression. And so it's a very different way of defining the function. But it still has the same outcome when that a function gets created that we can call. Now in this case, the function's name is say hello. Or sorry, the function's name is greet, but we can't call it with greet. We call it with the name say hello. Extra confusing. Yeah.
How would actually make the like greet function work? Say you want to like call it say hello. How would pass in the name variable?
Yeah, oh, same thing. So it's a function that takes in an argument. That's a good question about how do I call it. When we call it, we still call it like, you know, it takes in one argument. Otherwise, it's going to get undefined in it. So same idea. I could say hello, right? So I would do say hello and KV. Or I could do say hello to and KV. And both of them will behave the same way because it's calling the same function. Where am I here? Say hello. Oh, it just returns. So sorry, the console log, right? Right? So now we're going to see the same thing happening because I'm calling it with the thing, or I'm here, I'm declaring it as another variable and calling it as that variable. Yep. What happens if you call console log? This line here? I see what you're saying. Well, we could have answered that in the previous file as well. Same question applied in the previous file, where we have console log, and then you just do greet, and then brackets. Well, you can't call greet, even though you have a function named greet. So even though, because you saw we couldn't do this, it threw an error, right? It threw me off a little bit. And so similarly, if you can't do that, you can't do this. If you can't refer to it as a value, how can you call it? It's got to be both or none. So this will also result in an error. And the error will be that confusing because we have defined it as greet and yet it's saying it's not defined as greet. Again, what? And so this is the general consensus in the community is don't express functions this way. Okay? Even though this is close to what we actually do often in the community, we do this. Because like, why give it two names, right? I like the idea of a function expression. We'll talk about why. Or maybe I'll ask you why. Over function declarations, which we saw in the previous file, where it was function space name, right? Function greet. Here we're saying var could be called greet equals the name of the actual function. And does the function have a name? The girl does not have a name. What is that? Is that how he says it? The girl has no name. The girl has no name. The function has no name, right? Sorry? It is still going to be say hello. So the function has a name, but the function has no name. I don't know which it is. Are they? Oh, I thought we do mostly this one, the one from we do mostly, oops. We do mostly this, don't we? In our gists and stuff? Pretty sure. You may have come across it in some other document that we linked somewhere else. Like in Eloquent JavaScript or something. Because the community, yeah, it might have thrown you off, which is why I guess, good, right? It's a bit of a like, oh, what was that about? And so we're talking about what that was about. This is the more common and agreed upon way to declare functions. Sorry, I guess they're declaring functions, but they're called function expressions. Okay? So going forward, you could create all your functions this way. Now, here's the curveball before we take our break. And this confuses me as well. Because we saw that you can give it two names, right? It's a valid JavaScript, although you can't refer to it with the name on this side. So if I open up a very popular JavaScript style guide called Airbnb JavaScript Style Guide. And different companies have different style guides. Airbnb's is very popular. You all probably know what Airbnb is. Most of you. Well, anyway, they are a company that does a lot of web app development, and they use Rails, Ruby, and they use a lot of JavaScript. Okay. And so for the JavaScript, they're like, we need a style guide because like there's so many different ways of doing this stuff, as you already saw. And so when it comes to functions, this is what they suggest internally and to the community. They say use named functions, so like greet, but expressions instead of declarations. So they're saying this is bad. Can you see this? You can see this. Can you see this in the back, or do you have to squint? Let me zoom in a little bit more. This is bad. This is our our function greet is bad. They're saying even this is bad. Oh, they're using const, whatever. We use var. We'll get to const. Don't worry about that. But var foo equals function, they're saying is also bad because function needs to be named. And so they actually say do this, which I don't agree with, but this is what they say. Most people don't do this. So this is one case where I would say their guide is a bit non-popular, but in most cases it's popular. Like this is what we just did, right? We did var say hello equals function greet, right? And this is what they're suggesting is good, because there's two names here. There's a long story about why, because as you can see, like here they explain why, and there's a whole discussion as a GitHub issue on people going, what? Like, what should we do here? And there's conversations, either Airbnb employees, other people chiming in from the community, and then some semblance of a agreement, or one person just saying, you know what, we're doing it this way. And you can read through that if you like. I've given you the keywords to Google this up. But I don't think it's necessary for you to be successful today or this week or even in boot camp. So it's consider it stretch. Okay? Have I exhausted you already without even getting into the meat of the lecture? Hopefully not. Because so if in case I have, we'll take a break, 5 minutes, and we'll resume in 6 minutes. Okay, so I expect everybody to be back in 5 because we have a lot to talk about. Cool beans? Thanks. Okay, we're all back, so we're going to resume. I'll give a few seconds for people to finish their things. Are we all ready? Mentally? Okay, so this is where we left off. We realized that what we could do is have different ways of declaring functions, just a quick review. And while we're comfortable with function declarations, what we're starting to understanding today is more of the function expressions, which, your name again? Karina? Suggested that she had already seen before in certain external or internal. Yeah, it might be in the library. Yep. Yep. So we let it slip sometimes, but we're going to switch to this more. But you're supposed to be more comfortable with function declarations, right? Just function space greet. But what we realized is we can also do this. Now, what's interesting is this function is technically anonymous. It has no name. So there's a thing in JavaScript called anonymous functions, and all it is saying is a function with no name. A function with no name. Because if you just look at it from this perspective, it has no name. It's only that it's assigned to a variable with a name, but the variable points to an anonymous function. Well, what I'm saying is actually not true, but let's just assume it's true because the Node has kind of changed a little bit. Node has changed its mind, or JavaScript has changed its mind on that. But there is a thing called anonymous functions, and essentially what we have here is an anonymous function assigned to a variable called say hello. Right? Because we also even saw that even that didn't even work, right? We couldn't call greet. So might as well make it anonymous. At least that's my philosophy, even though Airbnb says do both. And they'll have a whole explanation as to why. I think that explanation no longer applies. Again, because JavaScript has evolved so quickly, people are catching up and changing their opinions on things, right? Right? And so this is an anonymous function. See, the awkward pause pays off. See that? Anyway, sorry, question?
Yeah, if there was you just put the function without declaring the variable, just function.
Yeah, so that is a good question. We will actually do that, but we will not do it like this. This will actually fail. Because now the function is anonymous and not assigned to something, and this is actually, I believe, invalid JavaScript. So I think it'll say syntax error. I think. Let's confirm that. It literally does not expect that as part of the language. It's no longer valid JavaScript. Even though, wait a minute, right side of a variable assignment should be valid JavaScript, right? This was the right side, and I should just be able to do that, right? Why not? If I have var x equals 5, can't I just say 5? That's a valid expression, right? That shouldn't be an error, right? I don't think it is. I took the right side of the variable, but for some reason, when it's a function like that, it's not valid. You either give it a name here, or you give it a name here, which is the way that the community suggests that you do it. Yeah, it's just a general convention, even though you could do it. When you have so many different ways of doing things, it can lead to a code base, an application that has too many different styles. And I would rather you just pick a way, even if it's the way that the community doesn't agree on, and stick to that, as opposed to doing both, because that's even more confusing. Right.
We became like a var, so we can change our variable name. So here we can change after that.
So here we can change our variable. We cannot change the variable name, though, right? Once we create a variable, as I drew it during the break, if I create a variable, that's the name of the variable. I can't later go change the name. I can create a new variable called sayHello2 and make that point to the same function. But just like function names can't be changed, variable names can't be changed, right? I can't go edit sayHello equals sayHello2. You know what I mean? Does that answer your question? Are we good so far? Okay. So we're going to put all this aside and talk about a problem. So some more code thrown at you right here. We're going to refactor this. So this is nothing that you're too unfamiliar with. It's just function declarations, I guess. Eventually we'll get more comfortable with expressions and we'll have declared these functions differently, whatever. But essentially, imagine a software that is has a bunch of functions that maybe describe what I would like for a robot or an individual to be able to do with some discrete tasks. So perhaps during the break, there's a function to control this person or robot to go to the kitchen and do something. In this case, refill coffee. Or go to the kitchen and refill water. Go to the kitchen and clean up. Right? Now the console logs there are like, they're not actually making anything do something, but you can picture when you see that console log, some instructions are already there, right? So in your mind, you can use imagination for what that actually is, or whatever. You can assume that this is giving a human instruction, and so it describes how to go to the kitchen, something like that. I don't really care. We see a bit of repetitiveness here, though, right? And we should be able to kind of sense that there is some commonality between all of these functions that could potentially be dried up. The word dry meaning DRY, meaning don't repeat yourself, right? And so we could potentially, we see a repetition here, and the repetition is go to kitchen. Exactly. So I guess my question then becomes, how do we refactor this so it behaves the same way, but maybe it's a bit more clever, such that if we have 100 of these, and go to kitchen isn't expensive, like it's not just a console log, it's like a bunch of things, 10 lines, let's say, we don't have 10 lines repeated in each thing that requires them to go to the kitchen first. Right? So how could I refactor this? Yeah. Go ahead. Make that a separate function itself. Not a bad idea, right? So I would do something like and then just take these, right, and make them go to kitchen, right? And then paste that here. Yeah? I think I did that right. Well, I should have first run this, made sure it worked, then refactored it. So I already did something bad, right? Because I don't know if I run this and if it doesn't work, I don't know if it's my refactor that broke or if the original code was already broken, right? But c'est la vie, I'll just keep that in mind. Let's hope that it would have worked, and now it would work. Now, none of these functions are being called, so what I expect when I run this file is nothing in terms of output, because they ought to be called, right? So let's just call one of these to make the point and see that actually works. So what I expect is that this gets called on line 23. We go to line 14, because that's the refill water, and so it'll run the first line here, which will run this, and then come back here, and then run this. So it'll output going to kitchen, and then it will output refilling water. And this is a fair enough refactor. Nothing wrong with this, right? But I think we could do slightly better. What if we actually flip this on its head? Instead of these functions having the responsibility of doing both going to the kitchen and doing the thing that they were supposed to do, what if we actually made it slightly different? what if we made it so that we actually have a function that goes to the kitchen, tells them to go to the kitchen, and then the actual extra behavior of while you're there, right, while you're in the kitchen, is behavior, right? This is what I want you to do while you're there. And we know behaviors are functions. Functions are behaviors. So perhaps I can actually pass the behavior to my generic function of what to do when you're there. So the way I would refactor that would be something like, we'll keep this one here. We'll kind of create another one. Go to the kitchen, and while there, do this. The naming here is deliberately too verbose to make a point. It's not how I would actually name this function. All right. And we'll refactor the name afterward. Right? And in that case, what it would be is it would go to the kitchen, and then because the function is being passed in as a value to this function, how do you call a function? You just use parentheses, right? So I'm actually, in this case, I have a new function now. Let's call it. Okay, we're not done with our solution yet, but let's call it. And while there, that's the function call, right? I'm calling that function, but it expects one argument, right? It expects one argument. Actually, I'm going to comment out this thing so that we're not breaking things or confusing ourselves. Okay, so coming back to this. While you're there, I need to pass in a function here. There needs to be a function here. Can't be code. It's not going to be 5. Let's pass in 5 and see what happens. Why not, right? Let's experiment. What is it going to actually do? It's going to assign 5 to do this. And then it's going to try and call 5 as though it were a function. It's not going to work. 5 is not a function, right? 5 is a primitive type. It's a number. Right? We learned about primitive types yesterday, right? So let's run that file, and what I expect to see is an error at runtime. And it's just confused because it's like, that's not the type I expected, type error. I expect to do this to be a function because you're using parentheses to call it. It's not a function. So we got to give it a function. And what's nice is we can now have individual functions of what to do while there without even worrying about going to the kitchen. Okay. So now these functions become like this. Refill water. Right, and that's this one here, refilling water. And so what would I do here? What would I replace 5 with? The function. Are we agreed? Are we in agreement there? See where I'm going with this? So I call this function, and I need to pass it a function, and that's my function right there. This becomes a callback function. The reason it's called a callback function, anybody want to guess why the words callback are used to define this type of function? You're onto something, but I think what you're saying is correct. Calling another function, right? Why is it called callback? It's not called call another function.
It's calling and getting back the
Yep. I think your mental, yep, you're onto the right thing. Explained by someone else as well, just to confirm. Well, he had his hand first, so why don't I go with him? Yep. Name again? Chris, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The function is being called back by the function it's being passed into. So if you want to use an analogy of going to the kitchen, is I'm basically saying, Min, go to the kitchen, call me back when you're there, and I'll tell you what to do then. You literally have a cell phone on you, and we have that kind of thing going on. And you're going there, you have no idea what you're doing there. So go to the kitchen, and while you're there, and then you call me, and I'll tell you what to do next. Right? So this is my second step that I give you once you're there. Right? because I'm not doing it myself. Right? I'm passing you behavior once you're there, once you're ready. Right? See that? And so what we've ended up with is essentially a slightly more complicated function in that we have to understand callbacks at this point, so it's a little bit more advanced. But a very common pattern that's used in JavaScript, where these functions take in functions. Because remember, they're values, right? Functions are values. They can be passed around. They can be assigned to variables. They can be console logged. Therefore, they can be passed into a function. And let's take advantage of that. Let's create these more generic functions that can take behavior. They do something more generalized. And then for the special work that they actually have to do, they're given that as a argument, as more information, as a callback. Are you with me on that? So the way this code runs is line 17 executes, right? And this function is referred to but not called. Line 14 does not execute from line 17 because we didn't do refill water like this, did we? We didn't call refill water. We're not ready to refill water. We're just giving that behavior over to min here, who is this function. Right? And so really, from line 17, JavaScript will go to line 9. It'll execute this, and then it'll be like, oh, I guess I was passed in an argument. When we're looking at this, we have to go, what was the argument that was passed in? It was refill water. So this line 10 will execute line 14. So line 17 executes line 9, which is the going to the kitchen part because of that function call. And then line 10 inside of that function calls this other function, and therefore executes the body of that function at line 14. Question from Andrew.
So in that scale that you're working, or the scale that you're working on when you're creating the other functions there, those are all a function of they're all potential value of the
Exactly. So now I can create function, what was the other one? Grab coffee. And now I can just do, and what it's done is it's cleaned up these functions where they don't have to think about going to the kitchen and doing it. They're assuming that you're already in the kitchen. So they're very atomic now. They're single purpose. There's something called the single responsibility principle, another acronym for you, or abbreviation rather. This one's an acronym because you actually say dry, right? This one's SR, you don't say SERP. But single responsibility principle is a good thing to always keep in your mind, which is this function doing too much? Is this program doing too much? Is this thing doing too much, whether it's an object or a function or whatever? And so in our case, these functions are single responsibility. They're just responsible for doing the task at hand, versus before, they were responsible, you can see the word and in there, right? They were responsible for too much. Yes, they were delegating that work to another function, so that's better. But what would be even better is if they didn't have to worry about that at all. Yeah. Name? It's going to take me a few. Yeah, Tom, and then another T name. Theo. Tom and Theo. Okay.
So like when you're creating functions, are you trying to make them less specific as possible?
No, you're trying to make functions as more specific as possible.
So like if you're creating one function, you want it to refer to like other functions to get what it's doing instead of making one function that does all of that.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
So you're making a function that is
less specific functions.
yes. In creating these to be very specific, I have created a more general function.
Yeah. That like another function can call those if need be.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a good way to look at it, right? This more complex function is a necessary evil to clean up these, right?
Yeah.
Because this one's a bit more complicated, right? It's going to the kitchen and, so it's not necessarily single responsibility, but look, it's focused on going to the kitchen. And before we had all of the other ones calling go to the kitchen, this time it's flipped. Go to the kitchen is calling those functions, right? Go to the kitchen and,
Yeah. So it's
right?
technically
So just to recap what I'm saying, before we had this. We had to call go to kitchen, and the specific functions were calling go to kitchen. Now it's flipped because go to kitchen and will call the necessary action, allowing all of our specific actions to be very, very specific. Like very, I'm using too many words to describe what I'm trying to describe. It's probably throwing you all off, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. And if not, don't worry. We got another more practical example of this coming up before we end the lecture. So we're not done yet. We're going to apply this to be more real world next. So if you're not fully getting it, don't worry. Can I leave it there and move on? Yeah? Yep. Oh, did I actually, I ran it? Or no, I didn't run it. I can't remember. Too much code that I didn't run here. That's bad practice. So go to the kitchen while you're there, and then refill water, grab coffee, and then I shouldn't have any other function calls here. So what I expect to see is going to the kitchen, refilling water, going to the kitchen, grabbing coffee. Oh, whoops, I copy paste error. And we see that that is working. Like we can actually pass in a function, and then the other function is calling it. Holy crap, that's really cool. Where this becomes really applicable, right? Some of the stuff that we do, because we said software is behavior and data, right? We're often operating on the data. The behavior is against the data, right? And so quite often what we are doing is we have a collection of information, arrays, objects, whatever they may be, and we are doing something with that data. The simplest, of course, is just loop through the data and output it to the screen. But, you know, that's just one kind of common thing. Another one could be we want to loop through, yes, but only output certain data, right? We have a million users, but we want to only look at our active users, right? And so I'm going to loop through all of the users on, I don't know, whatever platform, Twitter, and I'm actually going to only, in this report, output users that have more than one tweet, right? So that's an example, a real-world example of like a loop and then some logic along with that loop. Agreed? For each of those, check to see how many tweets they have, and then output if they have more than one tweet. Right? Maybe next time, it's not about outputting them; it's about putting them into some other collection, so that we have people who are still active, and then further doing some operation on that subset of users. Like, okay, they have a tweet, but they must also have 50 followers because our report is looking for that, right? So as you can see, there's very common kind of things that we do, such as looping over data and then doing something. Looping over data and doing something. Sounds a lot similar to going to the kitchen and doing something. Except you're doing it for every element, right? So it's like loop through the data, go to the kitchen, and do something with each time you're in the kitchen, or each time you have a user in the data list. See that? So what I'm going to show you is an example that is using a built-in function called for-each. Okay, and for-each is commonly used in JavaScript, where you have a collection of, in this case, names. Just created this before the lecture. And we'll just do names.forEach and pass in our callback. Normally how we loop through this, if we want to output each of these names to the screen, is we would do a for loop, right? So on. But imagine that you're just doing this so often that writing out that entire line of for var I equals 0, I is less than length, I plus plus, give me a break. I'll just have a for each function that does that for me. But then the actual inside of that loop, which is the important detail, I will fill in with the behavior that I pass in, the and do this part. Okay, so that'll be my anonymous function, or rather my function. It could be any kind of function. It could be an anonymous function. It could be a named function. So let's actually first do it the wrong way, which is to the unconventional way, which is to define that function. And of course, in order to print a name, the function needs the name. Okay. And then we'll just say print name. We're passing in, we're not calling print name. It is being called back. by for each. Just like the go to kitchen and was calling our function, right? Remember that analogy that we talked about? Here, the same thing is happening. The print name is the callback function being passed in to the generic for each function. So what I'm showing you is something that is a new tool in your toolbox, which is you can take an array and you can say dot for each. And now that you understand callbacks a little bit more, you can pass in a function that does that each part for you. So in this case, we're doing something simple, right? We don't have any if conditions or anything, but we have total control of what we put in here. You know, we can say only print names that have a certain length or beyond. So we can say if the name length is greater than 5, then print the name. Or whatever. If we had users, we would check if they're active or not, right? So what I expect for this to happen here is very similar to that for loop that we are used to writing, where we see each name being printed out. This is for each, line file 4. Right, so it's behaving very similar, except I've written it very differently. This is not the idiomatic way of using for each, so we're not done yet. But any questions on the control flow, any confusion around what's actually happening and how, based on everything that I've built upon so far? Maybe I haven't fully clarified that for you. It's okay if you don't feel like, oh, I'm probably the only one that, if you don't understand, chances are there's other people in this class who need that clarification as well. So let's do it before we go further. Name again? Chris, Julian, and Andrew have questions. Who else? That's it? Just 3 people? Okay, all 3 of you blurt out your questions at the same time. No, I'm kidding. Let's go with you first.
So for each is a built-in
Julian.
function.
For each is a built-in function on array.
What does it look like on the inside? Like what's the return?
What does it return? On the inside is the function body. So are you asking what does the function code look like? Okay, because we will actually build our own for each next.
Okay.
So we will actually answer that question. Right? So that'll be answered. What does it return is a different question. I guess it's part of it, but like that's different. But we'll maybe experiment with that, not as important. And then we have Andrew and... Okay, great.
So that's assuming, because when we
Terrible with names. I forgot your name already. Chris. Okay.
that's assuming, so we'll call it print name function, right?
Yeah.
It's going automatically passing names as a variable.
Yeah, good point that you have just observed. Somehow, I have to know as the programmer that when I pass in a function to for each, that for each, when it calls it back, is going to give it one argument. So this is going to be in the documentation. Okay? Because it's an argument, right? Print name is an argument, and then it's being called. Well, when a function's called, it's given stuff or it's not given anything. It could be 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things, right? And so I have to, since I don't have control over that function being called, I'm told what the argument list is going to be. Okay, and we'll look at the should we look at the documentation to confirm this? Let's do that. It's a great question. JavaScript for each, and of course Mozilla, their documentations, although very technical, are the kind of go-to, right? I mean, it's actually quite a simple explanation, quite a non-technical one-liner, which is nice. The for each method executes a provided function once for each array element. Right? So you provided a function, and it calls it once for each element. So if there's 10 elements, it'll be called 10 times. And we see that right here. Now, notice that they do it slightly differently. And that's what I was saying, is that this is the way we've done it is not idiomatic. And we're going to circle back to these anonymous functions that we talked about earlier, and we're going to bring them back. So the thing is that we know that we can't do this, but what we can do with anonymous functions, this is an anonymous function, is we can include them into the function call all at once. So while anonymous functions by themselves either need to be assigned to a variable for them to work, right? Because they won't work like this. We saw there was a syntax error here. But another way that they are most commonly used, anonymous functions with no name, are, this is going to look confusing and kind of be a little bit mind-bendy, but eventually you get used to it. Because this happens a lot in JavaScript, where you see the part that I've highlighted here is the function definition, the function is being defined, and passed in all at once. I'm going to kind of pause here so you can look at this and stare at it and see that happening. So this close parentheses here is the close parentheses. What's nice about Sublime or VS Code, whatever you're using, is that they do highlight the matching opening bracket or closing bracket, right? And so this curly bracket here is for this opening of the function. And so this is our function definition here, which, yes, we could assign to a variable and then mention that variable in here. Or, as we said, we could see it all in one line, right? Well, it's not really one line, but you get the idea. Lots to talk about in this lecture, eh? It's pretty heavy. And we're not done yet. It's probably, what, 10:35? 31? We've got, I don't want to go all the way to 11. We'll try and end earlier. Although often I do end up going to 11. Bad habit. Because next thing what we're going to do is we're going to understand how for each actually is implemented by implementing our own for each. So we're going to look at it from the other side, right? Because we did this kind of with the kitchen thing, but we're going to do it again in this way to understand what's happening. Shall we? Or questions before that? Let's make sure this works, because we didn't run it. Same behavior. So instead of declaring the function and then calling it, we are just doing it all at once. So this all right? We saw both this, where we pass it in with a name, and we see here inline anonymous function, right in there. Right? Okay, let's define our own for each now before we end the class. So who wants to help me with this? How do I get started? Any suggestions? For loop. First, I probably wouldn't want a function. Yeah. Sure. So before I do any of that, I'm going to run the file, because that's something I'm forgetting to do. Just make sure that what I expect is this is a valid JavaScript file. It won't output anything, but it won't fail or give any errors. Next, instead of going straight to the solution, I'm actually going to do incremental development here. And I'm going to actually use a different technique that I haven't shown you yet. Maybe Nima has already, which is I'm going to focus on errors and work on this incrementally. Okay? So what I would ideally want is to be able to call the function for each. Let's do backward. So let's be like our for each is actually going to go the other way. Because for each already exists. Why would we create that? But for each backward does not exist. So we'll create for each backward. Looping backward on this. So we'll say for each backward. And then I would pass in the data. And then I would pass in some more information, which is the callback function. And then it would do something. It would like, hopefully print out each of those things. It would say world, then lighthouse, then hello. But this function does not exist. Yeah? And so what I expect is function does not exist, or is not defined. Now I'm going to go ahead and define that function. Now, we can do a function declaration, but we're told that the better approach is function expressions. So we're going to do var for each backward is equal to a function. And that is enough to solve my error. Right? Even without taking in data or anything like that, This is enough for that error to be solved. It may introduce new errors, but I'm working incrementally and I'm solving errors as I go. And so I don't expect to see that it's not defined, because here it is defined. What do I expect to happen now as my next problem? Nothing happens. Data is passed in. In another language, it would complain that you're trying to pass in something to a function that doesn't accept anything. JavaScript doesn't care. So it's all good, no error there, and it will just not do anything, right? So that's my next problem. It's not really an error, but it's still a problem in that I don't have anything happening. And so at this point, I want to at least see that I'm calling the function with the arguments. And so I'll just say, this is my array here, and I'm just going to console log the array. That's my next step, is to at least be able to see what I'm passing in. So now what I expect to see is that array, but inside the function being called and console logged, so that I can actually make sure that the array is accessible here. So far, so good? Going too fast, or okay? It's okay. Next, what we're going to do is, I think we should even just create the function as though we're not doing it with callbacks. Just make a for each backward that isn't just for each backward, but it prints the things backward. So it's very specific. And then we'll make it generic. And so here I'm going to loop through backward, right? Somebody help me how to do that. Somebody hasn't gone yet. I don't think you've spoken yet. Have you? What's your name? Tim. Help me write the backward loop. Yeah. Just the regular for loop that you're used to. Yeah, so var I is equal to array.length minus 1. Yeah, and so, but a common confusion is until. This is a while condition. So loop while I is greater than or equal to 0, because you're looping backward. And what's the backward part? I minus minus, or I minus equals 1, same idea. And then what should I write in the loop itself so that I make sure that it's working? Minimum amount of code. I don't want to necessarily have the whole solution. It's the least I could do. Yeah, or even just print I, right? So here it should print 2, 1, 0. Cool. Step in the right direction. Now instead of that, what I want is the actual item, right? So var item equals array at I. Not array.I, right? Array at I, at the index. And then we can console log the item as well. So we'll have the index and the item itself also output, right? So far, it's OK. And we don't need this console log anymore. And really what we were hoping for is just console logging an item backward every time. Right? So this looks like it's a solution for print each backward. So really it should be called print each backward. But we want to make it more generic, because maybe we'll do this many times. We'll print backward. We'll maybe do additional operations while going backward on a data set. And so instead of doing very specialized functions that do the same thing over and over, which is looping backward, let's separate the looping backward part from what the behavior is once you're looping. And what that means is, instead of print each backward, we're just going to say for each backward, and we're going to pass in the callback. And the callback is what to do with each item. So therefore, with each item means it's going to be called inside the loop. And so here, we're actually going to not console log, because we're not going to presume that that's what the developer wants. We don't know if they want to print or do something else. And so we're going to actually invoke the callback on their behalf and pass in the item. So now this function is actually expecting the data and a function. Data and behavior. What to do with each item is the behavior. I don't know what to do. It doesn't care. Just tell me what to do. Right? Similar to the go to the kitchen. Don't care what is involved after, you can tell me after I get there. Same thing here. Don't care what to do with each item. You can tell me when I'm ready. And then you pass that in, right? And then it calls that behavior multiple times in this case because it's an array and it's looping. So what do I expect now? I haven't finished yet. It's incomplete code. What do I expect will happen here? What's the problem? What's my next error? What can you guess? Remember, we don't want to be on autopilot. We want to remember. We want to try and run the code in our head and see what will likely happen. What's the issue here? Yeah, callback is not being provided. Callback function is not being provided. So what does that mean? The second argument is being provided as undefined. That's implicit in JavaScript. So what will it do? This will be in our heads. This should come as undefined, which means it's undefined. It's trying to call undefined. Literally what's going to happen is like that, kind of, right? And so we should expect this kind of an error back. Let's see if that's true. Which file are we on? 5? Another language may have said callback is undefined and not a function, right? They may have been more descriptive, but JavaScript's just, it has its own way of defining these errors. Okay, so really the last step here is to define that callback function. And again, we can do that in line as an anonymous function, no name, and just pass it in. And so that's our second argument. And in here, we know that this function is passed in a single element each time. So we can just, whatever we decide to call it here doesn't really matter, as long as it takes in that element. Let's call it ELM for element. Or actually, since we know these are names or words, we can just say for each backward, and we know that we're getting a word in. And so we would console log, if I can just type, nope. When I run this now, I expect it to work. Now let's go back to the code. Backwards, it's working. World light us hello. We've got our function, which is a function that is generic, like for each, except we went a little bit different. We did for each backward. And because it's not a method on array, it needs to take in the array as well. Unlike for each, which doesn't need to take in the data because it's a method on the data. That's a separate topic. So it takes in the data and the behavior. So much like for each, it takes in behavior, and then it calls it multiple times, except it's working backward. And then we call it. We pass in the data from up here, and we pass it in a function. It could have been a named function. We went the more common approach of not giving it a named function. So this is what we see here. Does this seem more clear now near the tail end of the lecture, or still confusing? Still confusing. That's what the rest of the day is for, right? Is you're going to develop functions like, or use functions like for each, and go further. Is there anything else I want to say? Any questions, first of all? No questions?
So just to clarify, the for each, like the standard method,
Yeah, the for each that we used up here.
we made methods yesterday on like a library.
Yeah.
Then it's almost like everything is in an object for each.
Yes. When you see dot notation, the question is for each a method? Because I see that we learned about methods yesterday. May not fully understand them. That's fine. But yeah, this is a method. And the way I know this is the dot notation. Object dot key. Object dot property is another way to look at that. And in this case, this key or property is pointing to a function. And so yeah, it's operating on the array itself. And the array is an object. Arrays are objects. So we see that they have additional behavior on them, like for each. And that's why when you look at the documentation, it says array.forEach. What's interesting is it even tells you in the callback, look, I'll give you the current value as the first argument. right? And that's how we know that. It's in the documentation. But then it also uses square brackets, not to indicate array, but in documentation, square brackets means optional. So it's optionally going to give me the index. Oh, that's interesting. So if I go back to my for each, my callback function, which I declare right here, can not only take the name, but also an index, which I decide to call I over here. I could call it whatever I want. It's my function, right? But I can actually see which particular index I'm on. Right? And so we could implement the same thing in ours. For each backward not only passes the item in, but also the index. And now you can decide if you want to just ignore that index, not care about it, or actually say, yeah, my callback also cares about the index because I care about what position that word is in. And then be able to see that. It's just a matter of agreement between the general function and the person using the general function and the callback that's passed in, what arguments are being passed back and forth. One last thing before I adjourn. There is a name for functions that operate on functions. Here's a function that operates on a function. It takes in a function, right? It's one of its arguments. It needs it. Otherwise, it can't work. These functions, such as for each backward, as we defined it. There's others called map, filter that you'll encounter today. Many others. They are called higher order functions. It's just a name. I didn't want to throw it out there at the beginning and kind of confuse you or intimidate you. But that is the name. It sounds very complicated. It just means a function that can operate on functions. It's actually not a programming concept. It's a math concept. Right? We have functions in math. There's syntax and notation for that. And software is essentially, in many ways, mimicking that math, right? That logic. And so there's something called higher order functions in math, and therefore there's something called higher order functions in languages that can operate on functions, such as JavaScript. Everybody looks tired? That was a long lecture, and a lot of stuff to take in. So to recap before we adjourn, here's what we talked about. Functions are values. They can be passed around. They can be assigned to a named variable, of course, but themselves not have a name. So this is a function expression with an anonymous function, as we saw in one of the examples. And then they can be, therefore, also passed into other functions. These other functions are called higher order functions since they operate on functions. And when a function f is passed into a higher order function y, we call f the callback function because it's called back by y. Agreed? We also talked a little bit about hoisting. What else did we talk about? We talked about Airbnb style guide as something that you could potentially at least skim. But also we talked about how they have a different opinion on how to declare functions that KV and many others don't like. Right? Yeah.
What's your preferred style?
My preferred style is go with whatever that company or team is using. That's whatever they go with. So if I'm working at Airbnb, I'm doing what they're saying. But if I'm inventing the style or convention in that company or team, then I'm going with function expressions, which is essentially other style guides, KV, etc., prefer anonymous function expressions. So that would be what we saw in, I believe, file 2, which is right here. Now, if you're still using function declarations, it's fine. We're in a transition period where even our curriculum ought to, even in week 1, just do it this way and not confuse people. So those are some of the edits that we're working on these days. Trying to modernize it a little bit more, you know? But there's JavaScript's moving faster than any other language, so obviously that takes time and effort. But you can see many other people have different convention based on which, where they're at. So, yeah. You'll also learn a little bit about closures today. That'll be the real mind bender. And don't get nervous or anxious from not understanding closures when you're introduced them today. It is a pretty advanced topic. I'm kind of revisiting whether I want it to be introduced today in the future. And so spend your time on it, spend your energy. It's definitely good to know about, but maybe it's okay that it's like, oh, I don't fully understand this, but I'm going to kind of park it in my mind, and when I come back to the word, hopefully it'll help make that more concrete of an understanding. So just a heads up on that. Is that good enough, reasonable? Yeah? Great. I'll leave it there. I'll send out the notes. The notes will be more extensive than what I wrote out here, so it's not just a copy-paste of this stuff. And I'll let you go from there. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll see you actually tomorrow. I have a lecture with you tomorrow as well. Not usually the case, but it is what it is. So you have to put up with me tomorrow as well. Cheers.